Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philippe Berdo. I'm the Secretary General of Scale Up Europe, and I am pleased to welcome you to the fourth of our workshops of this great initiative aiming to enhance the creation and development of global tech champions in Europe. First of all, let me thank our partners, Viva Tech, Station F, Hello Tomorrow, European Startup Network, French Tech, Sifted, and Roland Berger. So the aim of this workshop is to try and find ways to bridge the gap and enhance the cooperation between corporations and startups. This cooperation is indeed essential to the dynamism and to the development of the tech ecosystem. But it is equally vital to enhance to enable our corporations to stay at the cutting edge of innovation and to foster the competitivity on the global stage in an ever-evolving global economy. So this is very much at the core of the aim of this initiative, which is to secure the technological sovereignty of Europe. So I'm very pleased to have so many members of Scale Up Europe community taking part in today's workshop to work on concrete recommendations to achieve this strategic objective. And I would like to thank and welcome our co-chairs, Belén Moscoso del Prado, Chief Digital and Innovation Officer of Sodexo, and Adrien Nussenbaum, co-founder and CEO of Miracle, as well as our moderators, Julie Ranty, Managing Director of Vivatech, and Marcus Beret, Global Managing Director of Roland Berger. But without further ado, I open the floor to you, Julie.
Well, thanks a lot, Philippe. Maybe Marcus will start with a few words on the purpose of the workshop today.
Excellent, Julie, thank you. I will do. And Philippe, thanks a lot. So why do we meet today? Today is all about bridging the gap between the corporate world and the startup world. So after 1 month of intense consultation, there's already a very nice list of recommendations that has been collected. So today's session will be around 3 key topics: develop winning collaboration models, bridge cultural gap and increase mutual understanding, and facilitate takeovers of scale-ups by large corporates. So each of these topics, we will have roughly 20 minutes. This should be time enough to discuss and especially to do an online voting and derive very concrete actions and recommendations. For the whole community, within the sections, please post your questions. We will try to cover as many as possible of them and bring them into the discussion here. We also would like to ask you to use our online chat and especially the live polling, which we are doing in all the 3 blocks. So probably during the session, you will here and there hear one of the most frequent sentences, maybe the most frequent sentences of Corona times, which is, "We don't hear you, you're on mute." So apologies up front if this happens here and there, but I think it's part of our normal life in the meantime. And I hand back to you, Julie.
Thank you, Marcus. And to discuss the 3 key topics you just mentioned, we have the pleasure to have with us today our co-chair that Philippe already introduced, Belén and Adrien. We also have Camille Croeli, Digital Services and Innovation Chief Officer at L'Oréal, Laura Urquizu, CEO at Redpoints, Barcelona-based SaaS company that offers a solution for detecting fraud, such as counterfeiting and piracy. Dr. Miriam Storim, Head of Innovation Strategy at BMW, Irene Gomez-Luque, I hope I'm saying it correctly, Open Innovation directly at Telefonica, Phil Chambers, CEO at Picon, which is a Danish platform to improve employee engagement, and that was actually acquired in this January, by Workday. So it's going to be interesting to share his perspective on takeover. We also have François Nuit, CEO of Allegro, which is a leading Polish e-commerce platform, like the Polish Amazon, who did an IPO at the end of 2020. Christian Lindener, head of BizLab at Airbus. And finally, Sacha Michaud, who is a co-founder of Glovo, the Spanish home delivery app, which recently became a unicorn and raised close to 500 million euros a few weeks ago. So congratulations. And a huge thanks to all of you for your great contribution so far to the Scale Up Europe initiatives, but also thank you to the whole community that is with us today, that has been participating to the poll and to the survey that we've been sent a few weeks before. That is really the material that we've used to prepare this workshop and to collect your reaction today. To name just a few of the participants, because there are so many great names here of corporates and startups, but Veolia, Volvo, Clarkson, Compnickel, all of them are with us today, and we really thank you for being here. Now I will leave the floor to Belen and Adrien, who will give us a first overview of the topic that we will cover today.
Thank you, Julie.
So
I hope that
perfect.
You can hear me. Good.
Yeah.
Perfect. So, Belen, thank you very much, Julie, for the introduction, and very happy to be here with you today. I think today we're going to have a very exciting session. It's absolutely essential for corporations. We have today a need to respond to the evolving consumer needs and create stronger differentiation, especially after what we're living today with COVID. And we need to make sure that we drive innovation to stay competitive, whether it's in our core business or whether it's in new models. Building strong partnerships with startups and scale-ups is really the key driver that we can have today to better adapt to this changing market, because it allows us to integrate that emerging technology as well as developing new models or scaling our innovation faster pace. One of the things that is important is that the collaboration between the corporates and the startups is a journey, and I think that it has many challenges. Large corporations, as we can see in the survey that we have gone through, need to be much more agile in the way they work with corporations. But I think that at the same time, the startups need to as well learn on how to work better with corporations. So I think we need to make efforts to get to a middle point where we find added value in both ways. I think we're learning every day, and we have done a lot of efforts, I think every corporation with the startups, but we still have some fundamental challenges to this collaboration that I think we need to, and we think we need to address in a very much global manner with a sharper focus. That is something that we will be discussing today and that we have been discussing. I think this opportunity in Scale Up is really a unique opportunity to get together and to get around a common goal and see how we can progress forward. It's a unique opportunity to encourage innovation in Europe. I think as European corporations, we must support the journey of scale-ups, and because they will represent, and they represent also the economies of tomorrow. So it is essential really to unify as one Europe around a common force to boost this collaboration between the European corporations and the European startups. And this focus needs to be on getting together and understanding what are the advantages that we can bring, and working as one force to make sure that the rise of the tech ecosystem happens across Europe. And I really think that governments play a key role in this journey. I'm very enthusiastic and really encouraged that the impact of this initiative that is having already, and that can have, it will be a real accelerator for this journey going forward.
Thank you, Belen. Hi, everyone. I'm Adrian Nustenbaum. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of Miracle. And when I was thinking about this event and the title, Bridging the Gap, Startups and Corporations, I tried to think about the fact that corporations mean very different things. For example, is Miracle a corporation? We have 450 employees, over 300 customers in more than 30 countries, offices in 6 locations, a valuation above $1.5 billion. Are we a corporation? Maybe. Yet, today, I have the honor of co-chairing this event and joining this event to contribute as a startup. So I guess it means we must be doing things differently than a corporation to be in that other bucket, operating under different constraints, being driven by different goals, maybe. And so as I was preparing this event, I went back to look at the list of our Miracle enterprise customers, going back all the way to the origins, 2012. And I realized that the first customer we signed, who was actually my definition of a corporation, multi-billion in sales, global operations, multiple lines of businesses, well, it took almost 3 years to sign that first customer. Why? Why was it so long, so complicated? What did I need to become or change to Belen, or learn to Belen's comment, to become, to earn the business of corporations? And I think that this is a key question, one that can unlock the growth potential of many of our brilliant startups. Beyond that, we are lucky in France to have an amazing, network of global corporations. Yet today, Miracle doesn't have a single global deal with one of them, not one global contract with one of France's large corporations. And we're still managing to grow at 100% a year. So what could it be if we could get to those partnerships better, faster? How many additional jobs would we be able to create? How much more value for employees, stakeholders, customers, and shareholders? So all in all, I think this is a very fascinating topic. And I thank the organizers and for having me and for having everyone participate in this discussion, because I think that if we are able to go beyond good intentions and identify ways to evolve mentalities, we can actually unlock a lot of value and jobs for our European startups.
Thanks a lot, Adrien. Then let's kick off the debate with the concrete action plans. As you know, we've sent out a survey to our whole community to collect your feedbacks on how we could improve the relationship between corporates and startup and how to develop winning collaboration models that can go further, that can go quicker. What do we need to do? What do startups have to do? What do corporates have to do? Whatever the definition is of a startup and a corporate. But what do each part needs to put in place to make it work? There are one point that made consensus right away. It is to further develop collaboration structures within corporates, such as innovation teams, incubators, accelerators, who are in touch day-to-day with startups. This one makes consensus. Then there are 5 discussion points on which we would like to have your feedbacks today. The first one is to further develop, is to set up a European platform for corporates to post their needs for resources and for startups to advertise their profiles and capabilities. Is to say, to match offer and demand. Second discussion point is to create a European collaboration barometer. Basically, it's ranking corporates on their level, quality, speed of collaboration with startups, but also showcasing case studies and best practice on working and efficient collaborations to both incentivize companies, large companies, to collaborate with startups, but also to show and to share this best practice. Third discussion point is to set up a European Small Business Act. We go into regulation now, establishing a mandatory share of corporate procurement to be allocated to startups. Fourth discussion point, create fast-track procurement. I think Adrien mentioned that he needed to wait 3 years to sign the first client. Of course, it was not all about procurement, but it must have taken some time, as we've heard a lot of times. So how can we create a fast-track procurement process for startups with specific terms, including shorter payment terms, shorter registration of new suppliers, but also reduction of requirements? That startup wouldn't have to show all their turnover, credentials, number of employees, certification, and 100 lines. That makes it sometimes very complicated to fill. And finally, the last discussion point is a proposition to develop an EU stamped list of scale-ups, which would kind of create a list of reliable and scalable offer to increase trust and facilitate corporates to work with those startups, because it would really be a reinsurance process. So as Marcus mentioned earlier, I invite you, all of you connected with us today, to vote on our poll for your preferred recommendation on these 5 discussion points, maybe to suggest additional ones if you have other ideas. And before we start, I would like to hear the feedback of our speakers based on their personal experience, because they've all experienced collaboration with success or with failure, I'm sure also with some startups and with some corporates. So let's start with Camille from L'Oréal and Sacha from Glovo. According to you, Camille, to begin with, which action items are the most relevant ones and why?
I think there's one that is a no-brainer for me, the fast-track procurement, and not just procurement, as you said it, the payment, but it goes also with the legal, the data privacy, the security, the tech, and of course the payment again. But this one for me is a no-brainer. It's something we've put in place within L'Oréal, and that actually we keep re-challenging. We re-challenge it quite often, because the more time goes on, the more you have a new process internally that needs to be streamlined again and again. So that one for me is a clear one. There's something I think also about the defining, back to the point of Adrien, defining what is the winning collaboration, and at the corporate level, being very clear on having a clear frame on what success looks like. What do we want to measure? What do we want to achieve? Is it a learning stage where it's at a country level and it's okay to go with a product that is not finalized, that is a very early stage, and it's a POC, and it's a small learning agenda together? Is it already something that needs implementation at scale in multiple countries? And then from the start at the corporate level, there needs to be something about a POC to scale approach, and not just an open innovation team on one side and then the business team on the other side, and it stayed on the open innovation team at the POC level. So you need to really, within the group, create that frame, and actually having this list of startups and scale up that have the roots and the size, the power to do impact at scale within the group. It's something that would be very valuable. For me, it's the two things. And then one last point about securing budget and resources within the group before entering into a contract with the company and the stakeholders, making sure you have the budget and resources that are saved. One of the ways to do it that I found quite efficient is within the market, we take X% of the business as usual budget to be dedicated to innovation. So that each time you don't need to go and fight for an additional budget for a new project, but you really have this safe budget for innovation, for disrupting the future, that is approved by top management at the high level, and that can be activated on this type of solutions.
Thank you, Camille. Sacha, on your side, can you share your experience?
Hi, thanks for the invite. Well, first of all, I mean, Glovo, the funny thing, this is a good one, because from us, collaboration with corporates or companies has been our ADN from day one. At the end, we deliver goods from retailers, restaurants, stores, large chains. And going back to Adrien's point, I mean, when we started Glovo in 2015, the first thing I did was start calling out to large retail corporations, hey, let's start working together. And they really didn't have a need, or they didn't see a need to work with Glovo. Fast forward 5-6 years later, now it becomes a competitive advantage where there's the pain points. If they either adapt, they'll lose out. So I think in global, the main things we see is digitalization of retail businesses, which I think been the last commercial entities to actually digitalize. And I'm talking about SMEs, which are 90% of our partners, but also large chains that they're moving there. So I think that's one of the things we can address. And then if we go to European context and what I'd change, I think the Achilles heel of Europe compared to the US or Asia is generally regulation and global regulation across the EU. I think we have an opportunity to regulate tech space in different ways, uniquely from a European perspective, from a social perspective, which many other regions don't. And it's one thing that, you're jumping from country to country. We're in over 20 countries and we have different regulatory issues from different everywhere we operate. And I think that's one thing that I think we need to address at a grand scale.
Yeah, thank you, Sacha. François, maybe you want to share your experience on that with the French-Polish approach, but also on e-commerce and distribution.
Sure, with pleasure, and thank you for the invite. Similarly to Miracle and Globo, some of us probably would find hard to define ourselves between a corporation and a startup, right? We're a corporation. If you look at size, we're 12 billion in capitalization. We're over 4,000 employees and growing very fast. If you look internally in the DNA of the company, we're a startup. And where there is an underlying theme, if you have many scale-ups like this that are growing fast, we tend to look in our neighborhood for additional help because we know we cannot do everything. And there are many services on the platform where we look for additional help, whether through acquisition, through additional partnerships. And that's where we start having a lot of collaborations with startups that are much earlier in the development phase. And building a little bit on what Sacha said, of course, things such as procurement processes and on that are in that list are helpful. But even more helpful is, do we have, how do you say, consistent regulatory across Europe when it comes to acquisition, when it comes to collaboration on data? And I know that is all on the agenda, but obviously the speed at which we move on this will massively help. There is no surprise, right? When we look, we acquired 2 startups recently over the last 12 months, and there is no surprise they were in Poland. And similarly, there is an underlying theme in this discussion of European strategic independence. If you have companies that are growing, that are winning, that are requiring more help to keep on growing, they tend to look in their vicinity, in their neighborhood, first in the country, then in Europe for additional help. And here we can make it much easier, right? If I look at regulatory approval for an acquisition, if it's across one country, it's one thing. If it's across multiple countries, the amount of difficulty is very different than what you would have in the US, for example. And there's a lot of environmental regulatory things that we can do in Europe. And that's the whole idea of the project, but at which we're not moving as fast as the intent is.
Okay, thank you, François. And we'll further elaborate on that on the third panel on how to make European exit towards corporates more frequent and how to ease the process. To listen to the voice of some of our corporates who are with us today, Miriam from BMW, do you want to elaborate on what has just been said?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here. That's a really good event and a really good initiative. I really appreciate that. And thanks to Sacha and François, I would take the same point, I guess. I mean, transparency is always very important. So there's nothing to say against a platform for corporates to post or against a barometer. But I think it's not the major problem, this transparency. We all know somehow where the people are and where the startups are. The critical point is more these regulatory topics, tax incentives perhaps, and more clear words on data, the regulation, and how to handle them. And that would make the business all easier. I'm not really happy with this setup. A European Small Business Act establishing a mandatory share of corporate procurement to be allocated to startups, because looking at automotive, for example, it is very crucial to have the perfect supplier on board. And if you don't have him, there's a problem to generate your car and to build it. And so first of all, the most important topic is that the process is running and not that there is a mandatory share of having someone in your procurement basket. So I'm not really a fan of this, to be honest. I'm more a fan of incentivizing and building up attraction for more business between corporates and startups, and not on these regulatory topics on a mandatory share.
Thank you, Miriam. Yeah, very clear. Phil, do you want to add on that?
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Great event, and some really good perspectives today. Yeah, so I'm coming at this from the point of view of the startup. You know, we started Peakon in 2015, scaled up to around 250 people, and as was mentioned in the beginning, we recently had an exit to an American corporate, to Workday, 700 million. It was around six and a bit years after we started. Thinking about our journey, though, we went from literally my living room here behind us to selling to some of Europe's largest corporations. So we work with Capgemini, for example, on a global basis. So we've had the challenges of how to work with them over time. Had a look at each one of the points. I think if we take the first one, European networking forums, I think ultimately this probably could have been useful to Peakon. There are a lot of corporates that have strategy gaps, and Miriam said we know who the startups are, but I think on the other hand, it's very difficult for the startups to know who the corporates are that are necessarily looking for your technology, who've got the right APIs that you could actually interact with, which might make a partnership a starter or a non-starter. I think, of course, like sometimes startups have to be screened and it might have to be under NDA because you don't necessarily want to review your strategy. I think in terms of a European collaboration barometer, again, it's not a bad idea. We wasted, a lot of time trying to partner with corporates that ultimately we weren't really successful with, or not understanding the barriers to entry. We personally wanted to partner with SAP, but there was a revenue hurdle over which you had to go, which was pretty high, tens of millions of euros, which is very difficult for a startup, to deliver, at least in year one. I think the regulation one is obviously very contentious. I'm generally not in favor of more regulations. I think it's very hard to design them well. That having been said, if you mandated startup spend at a level above 0.1, as we saw in France, that could have an absolutely massive impact. I just think that it would be a nightmare to write this legislation, and I don't really know how you would do it well. And like Miriam said, you might end up not building the best cars. In terms of fast track procurement, there is something in the UK called the G Cloud, which enables you to kind of write once, run anywhere in government, which, so all of your pricing, terms and conditions, and the legals are done once, and then you can sell to anyone. I do think that at a European-wide level, that if implemented properly, could really, really help startups and could save an inordinate amount of time in the sales cycles. So potentially something to think about. And then in terms of the last one, the certification, I think ultimately it's difficult to know if the solution is the one for your corporate company without having tried it, without having really good customer references. So I don't really see a way that could work, but that's just my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Before we move to the audience question, and please, all the participants, do not hesitate to be in the chat and to ask all your questions. Belen, Adrien, do you want to add something on this particular topic on top of your introduction?
So yes, on my side, I would like to say, what has been mentioned, there are a lot of things that are very aligned. So defining the value and how to create a partnership with KPIs, targets, it's a journey that for me is a must. I agree with Sasha as well that unifying regulation can be a huge accelerator, especially when we are in international or European corporations, because that is a huge slowdown for scaling up any project or any startup. As Miriam, I'm not a very good fan of the Act. imposing this, it would be counterproductive. However, there's one point I personally am very, given the experience I have with startup, I think it could be a huge accelerator, which is the fact of allowing startups or making sure that startups tell us in advance and in a structured way to corporations, where are they ready to scale in Europe? Many startups, when we work with them, they are not ready to work in multiple countries. We need them to work in multiple countries, and we find ourselves in funnels where we understand that these startups or scale-ups are not ready to go where we want them to go. The other point I think it could allow and support procurement is when we accept startups. Unfortunately, we as corporates must do by regulation a certain number of things. We have to take care of security, we need to take care of workforce and labor, we need to take care of data privacy, etc., etc., etc. And this is imposed to us. So we cannot work with suppliers, including startups, or do partnership with partners that do not comply for this, because this is our responsibility. And in that journey of making partnership, there are many times where we do not accomplish because we find that the startups are not covering those things that we are obliged to cover. So for me, creating a label where a startup could go through that journey, maybe through one corporation, and get stamps and have a checklist of things that you must have if you want to work with startup at a country level and at a European level, could be a huge advantage for someone like Adrien when he wants to work with corporations and really take that time from 3 to 1 year.
Okay, Adrien, what do you think of this idea of a country stamp?
I don't have any opinion on it. For me, it's it's very administrative, at least the way I react to it spontaneously. I just want to add on this topic. It's I think Camille said something about having innovation teams on one side and the business on the other side. I think that's the most fundamental point of all. And for someone who has probably pitched 1,500 corporations in the last 9 years, so I'm probably somewhere at the top of the list of people who have pitched to large corporations in terms of number. The reality is that innovation is often perceived as a technology angle. Oh, it's a new tech, it's a new app, it's a new thing we could try in our stores, it's a new thing we could try there. I mean, it depends on your business. But innovation, it's a mindset, it's a way of operating. And the fundamental, I think for me, change in innovation, it's empowering, and people within corporation are not empowered enough to take risks, to go faster. We talk about procurement, but procurement people, and I have nothing against them, but they are here to minimize the risk for the corporation they work for. And also sometimes they are also here to have pleasure and fun negotiating hard on smaller startups or smaller companies. And that's the reality I think Phil and the others who are on the startup side, we all face. We face people who just enjoy telling us we are too expensive, when at the same time their company is doing $500 million of share buyback because it's good for the shareholders, and they try to squeeze us for 2K per month. I mean, that's the reality of the world we operate in when you are in the startup world. So I think there is really something about the mindset. Innovation is the way it's not just tech, it's the way you operate on a daily basis. It's the way you go to work and you think about how you're going to drive change for your company.
This cultural alignment, will have the opportunity to go further into that in the second panel with Marcus, but that's definitely a key topic. Then Marcus, I think you have noticed some very interesting questions from our participants on the chat.
Yes, Julie.
Build on that.
Yes, Julie, we have very active communities, so we are tracking that in parallel, and please continue to do so. Some very good questions. I'll speed up. So first one from Klaxoon. We find it relatively easy to connect with CAC 40 accounts, but also with top American clients, but much more difficult to connect with corporate EU accounts. Why is that so? So I'm just giving that into the group here. I don't know who wants to take it.
Is that VC funding or corporate funding, or sorry, I missed the question.
No, I think it's about the broader business connection, be it on funding, be it on business, so finding clients. And the point is that this seems much easier with French accounts or with American accounts, but it's much more difficult within the EU. So it's a bit touching. It's a bit touching one of the key topics we're trying to solve here. And anyone with an opinion on this one? Why is it more difficult?
Miriam, do you work with French companies or only with the German companies, with German startups, for instance?
Yeah, I can. Oh, sorry. Was that me?
Go ahead. Sorry, Gary. No,
please go ahead.
I can understand the question because I mean, a company is big and not everything is open to the public. So from outside, we, for example, have a so-called startup garage, and we have a corporate VC, and this is well known. And so the best is just to write them an email. To write an email to somebody within deep in strategy, I don't know whether this would help. So it's easier to flag yourself, to show the flag, and to say, here I am, and I'm interested in you. Maybe this is what is written here. And so I just can say it is easier for startups, I'm sure, to see a company or a corporate with a dedicated CVC or a startup garage or a so-called accelerator or whatever, because you know there are people who are interested in you. If you don't see something like that, it's very hard to get in touch.
I'll just give you my perspective of my experience in global. So we work in a number of countries. At the end of the day, we work with large multinationals, Americans, Europeans, Asians, but at the end of the day, Europe is very culturally different, even though it's the same multinational. And we generally close deals with local teams. It's not about me or Oscar, or, traveling to these countries and closing deals. It's all about local needs and everything, and even within the same corporation. And to be honest, I don't necessarily think that's a negative. I think us Europeans should embrace that and see that's an opportunity, because companies coming or entities coming from other continents find that's very frustrating, that it's not one size fits all. And we should just use that as an opportunity of how we can adapt. I just wanted to add one thing a bit about the list that was passed. Maybe it's just a bit of, but I mean, to me, that list seems a little bit like, basically solving bad regulation by putting more regulation on top. Generally, that's my perception with generating that list, and I think that we should be moving away from that. There's an interesting thing in the financial sector, and we don't talk about it enough, which is called sandbox, which is the financial sector is hyper-regulated. So they've created this mechanism that you can actually try things out without actually going to the full regulation. And that's ideal, right, in an EU context of we should be allowing startups. And the moment you have sandbox regulation, all of a sudden corporates and multinationals are going to dive in that space because they're hyper protected. So the moment they have a regulatory opportunity to innovate, they'll be diving in that space immediately, like all of us will. And I think that's an opportunity that I don't think we're looking enough in the EU, and that would drive innovation across multiple sectors the next day.
Thank you, Sasha. Thanks a lot. Also, before we move to the next panel, just a few things that we've highlighted from what you've said. First, we've noticed that most of you are pretty reluctant to add some new regulations that are constraints and not incentives, and we'll have the opportunity to go back on incentives for takeovers afterwards. That it's all about aligning goals, ambitions with KPIs and targets. But also that it is all about culture, and that's a perfect transition with our second panel, because it's how we can empower innovation teams at corporates to take business decisions and who can scale innovative projects that they've identified, so that there is a common ambitious vision that is shared. So Marcus, maybe you wish to introduce the second topic that we'll debate today.
Thank you, Julie. I'll be very quick. So second topic, how to bridge the cultural gap and to increase mutual understanding. I think we could spend hours, but we don't have to, because you're all experts in this area on how the cultures are different. In my daily reality, dealing with both sides, actually corporates, but also startups, I boil it down to the simple fact that when I talk with corporates, it's mainly about revenue and sometimes EBIT margin, and especially EBIT margin, sorry, it's about EBIT margin. When I talk to startups, it's of course about valuation. And in a way, the two are linked, but the mindset behind is totally different. So this session here is how to bridge that gap. We have obviously a much more consensus within the pre-discussions than on the previous topic. We have two consensus points here. Encourage the development of mutual training forums for corporate executives and startup founders on each other's specific cultures. We have a second consensus point, which is set clear rules ahead of collaboration through co-creation of project roadmap, KPIs, and timelines. And we have a discussion point, which is about including best practices for collaboration in the European Collaboration Barometer, for instance, involvement of C-levels, inclusion of executives in startup advisory boards. And what we're going to do is pretty much exactly the same as in the first session. Please keep in mind the voting, so the poll. And a key question is now what our panel thinks about these 3 points, and of course the other ideas that have to be addressed on this topic here. So firstly, I'd like to hand over to our co-chair, Adrian, please.
Yes, so I mean, this point is obviously it's obviously a very interesting one. The complexity is that, I think as we saw in the first section of this conversation, it's hard to, I think personally, it's hard to create evolution through constraints. I know sometimes in Europe and in France, we love a lot to kind of create obligations.
Yeah.
But I think, unfortunately, I'm not a big believer in obligations. I also think that there is a natural evolution of the world, and it takes time. And I think that we are in the middle of a greater disruption, where a lot of the corporations of today are being disrupted by what used to be startups 5, 10, 15 years ago, and this will create long-time change. So the challenge, I think, for this group is how can we actually find something that can be concrete, or initiatives that can trigger evolution, smaller evolution as the big change is happening. So when I try to think about this topic, I think one major thing is that when you are a startup or a scale-up, fundamentally, the only thing that matters is growth. Growth. And you have an entire ecosystem, notably of funding, and some participants today are a good example of how funding has also changed massively. Companies raising $500 million for food delivery, companies like myself raising 300 million for software, for marketplaces. I mean, it's probably 1-0 more than what would have been the case even 5 or 10 years ago. And that creates a situation where for us, the only thing that matters is growth. And I think that when we engage with corporation, we are with companies who don't have just growth as a goal. They have risk mitigation, they have profitability, they have divestiture of some assets to reinvest in other assets. And so for me, when you talk about the cultural gap, the key element is how can we bridge that growth mindset gap? And I'm saying that in a way that it has to do on both sides. And I think both sides can somehow help each other. And I guess my point is, Belen said something around, startups need to understand our rules of engagement in corporations. And I'm saying rules of engagement, but it's how do we view things? How do we think about innovation? How do we think about investment? And I think for me, this is a very interesting point, because I think if we could create a culture where when startups engage with the corporations have a more transparent way of educating the startups. So for example, clarity of the decision process. I see a lot of startups, I've been myself, doing that for 18 years. When you have a first good meeting with a big corporation, you come back to the office, people ask you, so how did it go? Amazing. I mean, if you're in the US, you will say, awesome, fantastic. I'm putting it in Salesforce, closing Q2. When the same people at the corporation, they're probably, they closed the meeting, they went to the next meeting, they have 5 next meetings, and then 1 month later, they will discuss in the meeting review 50 different initiatives they have seen, and maybe 3 months later, one will start to go up to the divisional director, to ultimately go up to the... And in fact, when the startup thinks it's a Q2 deal, it's maybe a 6 quarters down the road deal from the corporation viewpoint. Yeah. And I think this is something, trying to create a culture where people who work in corporation, they take that immaturity in a way into consideration, immaturity of the startup, and they try to set more the rules. How long is it going to take? Who is really the decision maker? How can you create trust with us that we are not afraid to take the risk to work with you as a company? And then, of course, the procurement process, which I don't want to talk again because we've talked a lot. But so I think startups would very much welcome somehow a form of being educated by corporations. And probably, on the other side, I'm more looking for corporations to tell us, scale-ups and startups, what we can do.
What you can do. Yeah.
To help them.
No, Adrien, thanks a lot. Fully agree. Irene, Laura first. Laura, what do you think about this?
Well, first I have to say that I completely agree with Adrien, and I had to laugh when he was explaining the experience of a salesperson going to a corporation and saying about how amazing the meeting was. So, but so I agree 100%, but to bring some new topics, or maybe like to tell more, to put some practicity on this now and say how we can bridge that. Well, I think that to build a bridge and to understand better the startups, it has to be on the agenda of the CEO of the corporations, because the corporations are so big that the reality is that there may be even different cultures within the corporations, no? And for me, corporations have a huge opportunity with the startups, now to innovate faster, to disrupt faster, and but that has to be in the agenda of the CEO. If the culture doesn't come from the CEO, then, well, every department is going to act differently. So we're going to see that the legal departments, that are very usually the ones that we have to talk to, are much more conservative than the digital marketing managers, for instance, or departments. So I think that to make it real, to really build a bridge, it has to be something that is shared in the whole corporation, no? And on the other side,
no, go ahead.
I will finish now saying that
Yes, in the case of startups, it is very, very different if you are a startup that you're very small or you're a scale up. No, I think like Adrian saying, no, it goes very, very differently, and it is a must for any scale up or a startup to learn about the complexity of the companies or of the corporations, no? Because in the startups and scale ups, the sense of urgency is something that is in the core of the company, but is not necessarily the case of the corporation. So to bridge that gap is necessary that there is a training for all the startups leaders and all the scale up leaders about the complexity of the corporations that you're dealing with.
Thanks a lot, Laura. And now let's mirror that more from a corporate perspective as well. Irene, could you share your views?
Sure. Building on top of Laura, sometimes even from inside the corporations, it's difficult to navigate. My point here is that by definition, the cultural gap between the startups, scale-ups, and the corporation, in my opinion, will always exist. And because they are different animals, and that's fine, that's the way it is. But if we want to connect those different animals to make things together, in my opinion and from my experience, having dedicated teams to interface with the startups and to align the corporation internally, they are key to bridge this cultural gap and increase this mutual understanding. I believe that the creation of these teams should be promoted, and I think that's one of the keys among corporations in every industry, because they act as a connector, they act as a translator among these two different cultures and two different structures, and they support better these collaborations. We, for example, during these 10 years in Telefonica, we have wired as a dedicated team, and we've been able to work today with more than 250 startups. They are working with Telefonica. So that kind of units are leading internal efforts to bring these entrepreneurs closer to the corporations. But we do things like, for example, creating desks for commercial agreements. We, as a team, internally work with the legal units to speed up these contracts. We train the sales force to better understand the solution of the startups, and so they can include in the portfolios. In summary, is to create somehow APIs to facilitate these smooth connections with the corporation. And in addition, of course, if we are able to generate a network of sponsors at executive level or set specific KPIs, will foster this collaboration. So I think that's the key points that will help to bridge this cultural gap.
Thanks a lot, Irene. Let's move forward with L'Oréal perspective, Camille. And in the meantime, I'd like to remind the whole audience here to share your comments, your views. We will try to embed everything. Camille.
Yeah, well, I agree with what was said from Adrien, from Irene as well, from Laura. I do agree with this point. I like to think of it as, it's like the corporate and startup relationship is like a couple that comes from different countries and that have from 10 years to 100 years age difference. If you take the L'Oréal old lady, so you have the two not speaking the same language and not the same almost a century they've been created and they lived in. There's no easy answer. One of the things that I've found the most efficient is to have not only a dedicated team that translate, like Irene was saying, but to have in this team hybrid profile. People that are have a background in startup and a background in a big corporation or mixed within the team, so that they understand the two words. I myself was at L'Oréal, left to have a startup, and came back to that role, and I think that's one of the reasons it helps. I also do believe also in the fact of helping maybe profile to go from one company to another. And we have some partnership with startups where we have people from L'Oréal that go there for 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 18 months, 3 years, and then can come back or move to another role, but learn from each stage. And I believe there's a value in that understanding on both sides. And then there's something also about having this team with the necessary means, not only to be a translator, but to also act on the scale part and be very, very close to top management. Because as Adrian say, otherwise it's business as usual, and you go back to the other meeting, and that things can wait. The disruption almost can wait compared to the other things. And the only ones that should be sponsored is not only the CDO or whoever Open Innovation reports to, but a business sponsor and the CEO of the company. At the end, it needs to be the one that approves some of these big deals to make them happen fast.
Thanks a lot, Camille. Very good points. Francois, back to the startup perspective. Now I have to bring this most frequent sentence of Corona times and digital working. Francois, you have been muted. Thank you.
Go ahead. Happens from time to time. And thank you for calling us a startup. It's exactly what we see ourselves. Maybe recapping a little bit, right? You have thousands of CEOs. You're probably, in terms of leadership under, you have 100,000 people. You have hundreds of thousands of startups. So for me, trying to answer that problem through additional regulation really intuitively doesn't add up and likely will not scale. Now, there are a couple of themes that are recurrent here. You have indeed some help that larger company can provide into clarifying the rules of the game. So how do they take decision? How can they do that at larger speed, right? Startups by definition don't have the same headcounts, don't have the same legal team, procurement, to carry on longer processes. I think there's an underlying theme also, both in terms of government, but also in terms of corporations, is the acceptance of risk and failure. It's much too easy, notably when you have a large entity. Government is obviously the ultimate large entity. It's easy to focus on protecting, right? On focusing on the risk. When obviously for a startup, it's much easier to focus on the growth because that's what you have in front of you. So how do we create an environment, both legal and otherwise, that actually rewards change that rather than protecting from failure or risk? I think what one of the points that one of the other speaker mentioned, and I'll keep on insisting, consistency across regulatory framework, right, across Europe, massively help. So rather than creating more laws, making sure that the current laws, and there are a number of initiatives within the EU to tackle this, but we really early stage there. If you want to create a fintech across Europe, good luck as a startup. You need to start hiring a lot of regulatory experts. So, and obviously startups, they don't have lobby groups, they don't have PA teams, their future employees are not well represented by definition. So the voice obviously is much lower heard. And one last point from me, fewer rules, more consistent and much better enforced outside of EU. We're a little bit naive here. It's so easy to go to a startup and to a corporate and say, hey, this is the rule in EU, and we do. And then when you have other companies from abroad, how many down raids and audits are done to a company in Guangzhou that does the same process, right? Have that metric. And if we were able to disrupt this, we would be able to much better foster innovation within Europe rather than pushing it somewhere else.
Great practical points, Francois. Thanks so much. And we move on to Christian from large corporate perspective again.
Yes, many thanks for the invitation, first of all. So I think, I mean, main points have been said. I mean, from Telefonica side, learning on that you need to change internally first before you do something externally. All the inside processes, you have removing all the blockers in IT and HR and procurement, especially. There's, I think, one thing that is crucial. We just see too many corporates starting accelerators without even thinking that if they have their own internal processes ready or even the purpose to do so. Another thing that was mentioned, which is a minimum requirement, I would also say, if you don't have the top leadership on board, forget about doing something there. But there's a different point I also want to highlight from this experience is that it's really two different worlds you're trying to get the benefit out of there. The incentives are not always aligned, right? On the one hand, you have a corporate guy who gets his salary at the end of the month. On the other hand, you have a startup where you don't know if you're even going to get until the end of the month. So time is also a constraint there, where you need to really have people that understand both sides and have been in both sides. If you only staff internal teams with people that have only seen one world, it's not good. Same on the other side, right? I mean, when you grow in a team, you also need those executives that can play the B2B game, which is a very different one than the accelerator game. So all in all, I think all of it has been said here. So I'm not going to repeat anymore.
Christian, thanks a lot. And let's close the round here with Sasha.
Okay, I'll go quickly. I don't think I really have any advice, and I'm no one to give advice to corporates. No, I think they move a lot slower than startups for obvious reasons, size, but above all, their growth rates are generally much smaller than what they have to protect. So mistakes they make will have a much bigger impact on them, whereas a startup is generally growing much quicker, so they can make these decisions because actually it'll impact future growth, which actually they have less to protect. I think that my only comment would be, Laura brought it up, I think, which was a great example that this really has to come from CEO level. And I'll give you a really simple example. So when we started, one of my first phone calls was, to call one of the biggest, restaurant chains in the world to say, please, join the global platform. We're going to sell. It's amazing. You deliver in 30 minutes, and that, they wouldn't even pick up the call. They didn't want to see me. Fast forward a year later, that company changed their CEO in the US, and he sat down with the management team and said, delivery is the future. All of a sudden, they were reaching out and calling to us and changed their mindset. No, I mean, COVID's accelerated everything, but this is probably today 30 to 40% of their business. And this is a decision 4 or 5 years ago, and it needs to come. Radical change and embracing digital transformation, or call it what you will, really needs to come from high up if it's going to really make a significant change. Otherwise, you're just putting in accelerators, putting in little things in the company that actually doesn't change the dynamics.
Sasha, thanks a lot. So I think the discussion showed that there's much more consensus on this one, bridging the cultural gap. I liked a lot of the points centered around individuals and having the experience from both worlds. This is a lot about understanding. And let's take that as a bridge to the third topic. Julie.
Thank you, Marcus. So the third topic is about takeover, kind of the ultimate form of startup corporate collaboration. It's always a bet, we know, because it's about matching two organizations, two cultures, but it's also one of the greatest opportunity to scale innovation and to accelerate, both for the startups and for the corporates. But yet we don't see, for the time being, enough of them in Europe. So why is that? How can we increase the number of corporate exits in Europe? And how can we make sure those corporate exits happen in the best possible way? There's one consensus point that was pointed out by all of our participants, and that echoes what has just been said on the previous panel, is to develop trainings to startup takeover for corporate executives in collaboration with VCs and experienced entrepreneurs. Because we know that many corporate executives have little experience in buying startups and in collaborating so intensely with startups. So how do we make sure that it works, and how can we help them with some external forces as VCs and experienced entrepreneurs? Then there were 3 discussion points. The first one is about regulation again, but maybe you will like this one more because it's an incentive and not a constraint. It's to create incentive for corporate takeover of European startups, such as, for instance, tax cuts or extension of R&D tax benefits to startup acquisition. Second, to advertise and to promote success stories and takeovers by European corporates as a successful exit, showcasing that it can work and explaining how these corporate exits have worked and how they turned into a powerful tool of growth, both for startups and corporates. And the third one is to further involve the VC as a central player in the relationship and as kind of the central part to organize the exit of the startup of its portfolio towards corporate. So as in the two previous panel, I remind you that the poll and the chat is open. So all of the communities here, please share your views, share your questions, and we'll be happy to take them after we hear our speakers. We have with us today some examples. I said there were a few in Europe, but we have a few examples with us today of successful corporate and startup acquisition. First, let me start with Belén from Sodexo, who conducted 3 years ago the acquisition of Foodperi. Maybe you can share with us your views on takeover and really share some personal insights on the acquisition you did.
Yes, thank you, Julie. And thank you very much. I want to say that takeovers are for corporations essential because corporations also grow, and not only startup grow. So takeovers are very important because it's a way to accelerate our growth and in some form to disrupt many times our business models. So as Julie said, Sodexo is, because of consumers going through a massive transformation in one of the activities that we hold, which is delivering food services to our clients in wherever they are. And we understood that consumers were changing in the way they wanted to be served, convenience, etc. So one of the example that Julie mentioned in France is we made a takeover of Foodperi, that is a food delivery platform in France. What are my recommendations? I think that it is important to do takeovers, yes, but also to do successful takeovers. And this is where the culture becomes front in front. The first thing is, in terms, I think that the proposal to support with taxes is very important. Corporations like us, we want to grow, but we also play in a different game, which is profitability, which startups sometimes don't have the same rules. So when we make a takeover, we buy startups that need to scale up. We want to scale them up, and during a period of time, we know that we're going to have to invest a lot of money to scale it and to make it profitable as we want and as we have to. This period of time, I think, adding additional tax benefits or some kind of incentive to corporations could be a real accelerator for us to make much more, because there is a moment in time where if we want to do too many takeovers, it means there is a huge bucket of investment that we need to protect going forward, and sometimes we cannot do all of them. So that's one key recommendation I will highly support. The second one is, once the takeover is done, I think if I can have one recommendation, is to ensure that we protect the startup. Startups have a lot of very positive aspects in terms of agility, being able to shift, move, kill, start again, etc. So they are a real runner to gain market share. So I would, one of the recommendations is to ensure that we protect the startups, but potentially putting them in the organization somewhere attached to those translators that someone was mentioning before, that have a mindset that is between both, and at the same time bring the benefits of what corporations can bring. This is a huge advantage without bringing the administrative, bringing all the knowledge and all the magic rounds that we can bring from corporations to ensure that we make that startup profitable as soon as possible. So these are for me the two recommendations. We also mentioned VC partners and being trained and coached by VC partners. I think we as corporations, because it represents a risk, I think it is of high added value to have either profiles that come from this background, or that we put the people that are going to, at the end of the day, welcome those startups, that they understand in what world they're going to be moving with this takeover.
Thank you, Ellen. Phil, maybe you want to add on that since you've recently sold your company.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I guess when I was looking at the question here, I was thinking, like, what is the real question? Is it that too many EU startups are getting acquired by non-European Union companies, or is it that not enough EU startups getting acquired, period? So I sort of felt that you were maybe trying to question the first one. Why are our friends in the US specifically winning? I mean, I think if we're trying to keep it in the European Union, then I would agree with Belen, and that the tax break could be a no-brainer, as a competitive advantage for Europe. And I'm not going to pretend to know how this would play into WTO rules or any of that stuff. I know there are many disputes over other such subsidies between the US and the EU. But if this could be made to work, then I think it obviously it's going to make it an easier business case. I think in terms of advertising success stories in takeovers by European corporates as a successful exit, I don't ultimately think it's going to make a lot of difference. I think if people have got several offers on the table, they're probably going to take the best one. So really what we're talking about is trying to give EU corporates an unfair advantage, which maybe brings us to the next point, on use of VCs. I think ultimately it's all about information. Corporates want to acquire scale-ups with really good traction that can plug a gap in the product portfolio, and they need to be able to understand, therefore what the strategy is for EU startups. And of course, VCs have the information on the traction and that strategy. I don't always think that the alignment of the VCs will be necessarily, where the corporates want it to be, and they'll always want to get the best price. I mean, in our specific case, Workday has a ventures arm. So whilst they didn't do an investment into Peakon, we certainly were having conversations that have been sort of facilitated by the fact that they had a ventures arm, and therefore, they were privy to more information potentially. So I think that it could be a recommendation. I know a lot of larger European corporates are now doing this, is starting a small, ventures fund and kind of getting good visibility on who's coming up like that.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Miriam, at BMW, how do you approach this question?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I had the same problem when reading the question in the beginning, because I was wondering, is that really a target itself to take over scale-ups by large European corporates? I wasn't sure. I mean,
I think the two questions can be asked. Is finding more exits for startups, point, but also more startups in Europe. So
okay, understood. From a macro perspective, that's completely right, and this is what Phil said as well. If we look as European people here, this is what we should want, and so this is completely right. From a corporate perspective, I wasn't sure. So, I mean, there's something to say, and Phil has said it before. The first is risk appetite. There is a need to have more of that. And I agree that corporates do not have a lot of risk appetite. It's the same in my company. We don't have that. And if you talk about that, you can first talk about a better education at school and university, which is from the very beginning, but it's a good point. I mean, just have a look at German universities. They are incentivized by having patents or publications, but not for industrialization of good ideas. And this is really a small problem. I don't know how this is in France, but it is in Germany, and all these excellence initiatives and so on, which should promote all these German landscape of universities, just guided us to more patents and more publications on these indices, but not to more industrialization. And so you first can talk about better education and more and better and powerful universities. The second is the tax question, maybe again. How can you incentivize corporates to do so? And as far as I know, we have these regulations in France and in Germany. We have started providing tax incentives to VC investors a few years ago through lower capital gains taxes on an exit, or through the tax deductibility of VC investments. These are the 2 points. And I guess it could help to talk about a broader European landscape of tax incentives, not just in Germany and in France, which is good, but on the whole European landscape. So these are the 2 points I would mention answering this question.
Very clear. Thank you, Miriam. Laura, on your side at Red Points.
Oops. Okay. Yeah. Well, Miriam's approach is so interesting, but following what Phil was saying, it's very interesting how his company was acquired by an American company, and how, in our case, I mean, we do organic growth, but yeah, we've been approaching by companies in the past. We never did a transaction, or we have done a transaction because we think we can grow much more before doing a transaction. But all the companies that approach us were American again, you know. So why are U.S. corporations approaching European corporations and not that many European companies? No. Well, I think it's again the risk aversion. All the corporations, no, they are very risk averse, or they protect, no, the revenue. And in this case, for this specific topic, European corporations are more risk averse than American ones. And for me, it's about, is all the time the same thing, is how do you prioritize innovation in the company? How do you really become an innovation champion as a corporation, no? And again, it is about changing the culture of the company, coming from the top leadership. Is, okay, let's take risk here, let's do this acquisition, and if it goes wrong, it goes wrong, no? But it's again about deciding being an innovation and creativity champion, because otherwise all the innovation that the European scale-ups are providing, they're going to go to the other continent, not to the US continent. And so they have a lot to do, the European corporations here, about keeping the innovation in Europe. So also in this case, no, I think we tend to focus a lot on all the acquisitions that go wrong. It's said that 60% of the acquisitions go wrong. Well, I think that if us as Europe and as an ecosystem, no, the ones that were here, want to do something, we should really build a lot of business cases on the acquisitions that have been a complete success, and talk a lot about those successful acquisitions, and talk about those business cases and how the corporation has improved by acquiring XX scale-up or innovative company.
To make some other corporates wants to do the same afterwards. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Laura. Christian from Airbus, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I mean, first question, when going through it, why is it even desirable to take over scale-ups by corporates? I don't really think that is always the best solution. I think all of us, we can tell a lot of stories on how many times this failed. When we went out to the market, bought something, internalized it, and then destroyed it. So I would rather think that what would be the best way to interact there, and not always about taking them over or buying them. Obviously, for the founders, it is a great deal. I mean, I had that experience when we sold to Booking.com. This was fantastic because the price was high, and we surely but slowly saw how our technology was dismantled, and the team left. We did some vesting in P6 months, then cashed out, but at the end the technology got lost. And I think corporates need to be better in that sense on creating safe harbors for also the post-merger acquisitions. So rather than having the goal then always going to buy them, the goal would be to how to harvest them into the safe environment. That would be my that would be my recommendation for this one. Not always buying them. Startups are startups, and corporates are corporates, and that's good. They're very different. I don't think that the solution would be to buy them.
Okay.
Unless for the founders, they can cash out.
Interesting to have this perspective from the corporate side.
And maybe, I'm sorry to intervene, but I think we have a great example of the participant from Allegro, who actually we have the same shareholders, and I always speak with them and they say, look at Allegro, it's an amazing story. They went public on the Polish stock market. It's one of the best European IPO. And I think, building on things that have been said, our goal should not be to try and have startups be acquired by a corporation. Our goal should be to have European startups go public in Europe and create a culture where we have big asset managers and wealthy asset managers in Europe who are ready to have tech companies in their portfolio at high multiples. Because at the end, US companies will always have more cash to buy European companies because they are more valued, better valued by the market in the US. They have much more cash. And founders, as patriotic as they may be, they will sell for the more money, because once you sell, you're done and you move on to the next business. And so I think the real culture shock is the startups of today should be the CAC 40 companies and the FTSE companies and the DAX companies of tomorrow. And to that, you need to encourage companies like mine, who's thinking of going public in 2022, to do an IPO in Euronext and not on the NASDAQ. And this takes, everything from founder tax regimes. If you pay 40% on capital gains, you're going to try to go public in a country where you pay less capital gains. If you don't have a good community of mutual funds to buy and support your IPO when you go public, you will go to see the countries where you can have Fidelities and Wellington and Franklin and all the big mutual funds to support your company. So for me, the victory is when the CAC 40 will have half of all startups. The only tech public companies in France are SI, so SS2I, who have been existing for 20 or 30 years. It's a disaster. I mean, it's a real disaster.
We're not trying to say that all startup exits should be corporate takeovers. I mean, I think we all agree on that, but it's how can we offer more different possible exits to startup, that could be an IPO or a corporate takeover. And in the case of a corporate takeover, how can it work better and how can it work perfectly? And maybe to conclude on that, and before Marcus takes some questions and comments from the audience, Irene, you want to build on the corporate takeover?
Sure. I think that acquisitions can be a powerful way to shape in the portfolio of companies and to accelerate growth of those European corporates. But of course, this inorganic growth is a strategic formula that the corporate wants to apply. And if it is that the strategy that for growth, I think there is something important that needs to happen. I totally agree with Belen about, and I subscribe with these tax exemptions and deductions. But I think the first thing that for me is key to facilitate these takeovers is to have the capillarity and a real arrival into the entrepreneurial ecosystem, because that knowledge of how the ecosystem works and the deal flow that exists, I think it lowers the risk aversion in the corporates. There is risk aversion is something that has been mentioned from the different participants, and I think that's one of the keys to facilitate these takeovers. I think we should think about solutions to lower this aversion. And for me, having for example, a corporate VC as part of this internal team is something that I think facilitates a lot this next step. So my point here is and my recommendation, it's about incorporating corporate VCs as part of this commitment of the corporate.
Thanks a lot, Irene. I remind you on the last opportunity to go to the polls. And maybe since we are a bit behind schedule, I'll just put one question here from the audience, which is how do corporates ensure, and it's again about, kind of corporates acquiring startups. And just to remind you, there was a separate workshop session totally dedicated to the IPO topic, which took place yesterday. So the question on which we received here is, how can corporates maintain to the best extent possible the culture which comes in from a startup joining? Anyone here of the group would like to give a very quick response before we wrap up the whole session with the results from voting?
Yes, so as I said, our experience has been that there is a very important need at the beginning to ensure that we respect the startup and we maintain the spirit of the startup, and that little by little we bring it and we make it join the corporation. But we believe that we need to protect and learn from the startup. And this is a journey that needs to be done with care and years, because as you're saying with your question, there is a lot that startups bring to corporations. So that little thing that we need to make it grow, but without killing the startup spirit or what the startup brings.
Perfect. Thanks a lot to the whole panel and to the whole community here. I think we would share now the polling results before we close the session. So I'm looking at the slide here as you do. Julie, you want to jump in?
Yes. Sorry, I think for a few seconds I lost the connection, but I'm back.
Okay.
No, well, thanks a lot to all of you. I think on this third panel, I think it was really interesting to hear you on, well, regulation with another perspective, that on this side tax incentives could be a huge interest, but that there's also, because corporate takeover is not the only way of exit for startups, because it also has some risks. There is a big point about how to protect startups, how to protect them, how to protect its culture, its agility, not to impose profitability and constraints of the large group, and how a VC can help in that way, but how it also requires a training of the people who will be in charge of integrating the startups, and how do we help to develop the risk appetite, even from the kids' garden I heard earlier. So I think that's a good module for all of them to develop this entrepreneurial appetite, that it be in corporate or in startups. So now we'll move to the conclusion and to the very last session. And we wanted to share with you the answers of the polls that we've been surveying during this workshop. Maybe Basil, you can show it on the screen, the result of your votes, because all of you have been voting on the different recommendations that have been collecting earlier.
Julie, it's on the screen already. In case
okay, I can see it on my.
In case you have a connection problem.
Go ahead, Marcus, because it's not on my.
I'll just read, and the slide is on here since some time. So to the whole community and panel, you're probably reading as we go here. So on the first topic, create fast track procurement process for startups within specific terms was the mostly scored. On the second topic, on the cultural gap, set clear rules ahead of collaboration through co-creation of project roadmap, KPIs, and timeline. And on the third topic about the takeovers, create incentives for corporate takeovers of European startups, such as extension of R&D, tax benefits to startup acquisition. So I think that's nicely in line with what we discussed. And I'll hand over Belén and Adrian for very short closing remarks before Philip formally closes our meeting here.
Yes, so thank you, Adrian. I'll start again. I would like to first of all thank all the participants. I think it was a very rich conversation that we have. I bring three contexts with different animals. I like that sentence. We need each other, so that's for sure. And we have an opportunity in Europe to work together and create an environment that will allow us to support the European tech environment. I think we've discussed about preferring incentivized to regulation. So that is something that I guess that we all agreed. And we have a checklist of very interesting initiatives at corporate level, at startup level that involve both parties getting on these 3 or 4 initiatives that we mentioned. So I think with this, we potentially need to continue working together to ensure that this become actionable, that they don't become a wish list, and that we ensure that by this work, we continue to strengthen this collaboration and facilitate the collaboration between European corporations and startups.
Thanks a lot, Belén. Adrian, closing sentence. You're unmuted. You're muted. Please unmute.
the famous line. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. I mean, very quickly, because we've said a lot of stuff. I think empowerment of all stakeholders within corporation is important. Trust, when you're the CEO, set directions, but trust people below and let them take risks. Innovation, not just as technology, but as an operating model for companies. Transparency of processes when you work between startups and corporation. And I would be a bit provocative, which is not my style, as you've seen, but maybe in 20 years, we have the same discussion, but we invert, we say, bridging the gap, corporations and startups, because startups have taken the world and they are more than 50% of the CAC 40. Alléluia and vive la France.
Yes, let's go there. Thanks a lot, Philip, and we let you close the circle.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to you all. Thanks to our co-chairs, Belén, Adrien. Thanks, of course, to our two very brilliant moderators, Julie and Marcus, and our also brilliant panelists, Camille, Laura, Irene, Miriam, Phil, Christian, Francois, Sacha, and thanks to you all for the great interaction. I very much like the phrase by Belén, not only startups grow, corporates also grow. So I think it's a good motto we could bear in mind for the next steps. So next steps, just please keep in mind 2 milestones. Mid-May, we will come up with a draft report of all our work. So not only on this workshop, but on all workshops, and share it with you. And we look forward to your comments on that to finalize it. On mid-June, we'll have a big event here in Paris with President Macron to make the final report public and to share it with the wider world and to quick start the implementation. So looking forward to our exchanges and to these next steps, and stay tuned.
Thank you. Thanks to all. Bye-bye.